Unemployed factory supervisor Elena Rodriguez thought the strange, hollow sound echoing from beneath her kitchen floor while she desperately attempted to repair a burst pipe with $34 worth of hardware store supplies and borrowed tools was just another expensive disaster threatening to complete her family's financial collapse after 14 months of unemployment had destroyed their savings and left them 37 days from foreclosure proceedings that would eliminate 4 generations of family home ownership in Cleveland's Tremont neighborhood. But when her 8-year-old daughter Isabella's insistence on helping led her to pry up the wrong floorboard near their 1920s basement stairs, Elena discovered a hidden tunnel system that connected to the legendary bootlegger Anthony the Ghost Castellano's lost underground vault containing $300 million in Depression-era gold bars and cash that had been stolen from Federal Reserve shipments during the height of Prohibition, along with detailed ledgers proving that Castellano's operation had been secretly funded and protected by a conspiracy involving Cleveland's most prominent steel industry families, railroad executives, and federal agents who had been systematically embezzling government relief funds while using Castellano as a convenient scapegoat for their own criminal enterprise, that modern descendants of those same industrial dynasties have spent 96 years ensuring remained buried beneath Ohio soil, where missing persons cases involving persistent treasure hunters rarely receive sufficient investigation to threaten family fortunes built on institutionalized federal fraud and organized crime partnerships. This is the story of how a desperate plumbing repair and one stubborn 8-year-old's refusal to follow adult safety warnings transformed a broke single mother into the guardian of evidence that could expose the true criminal origins of America's industrial empire and destroy political legacies worth hundreds of billions of dollars. If this moves you, hit subscribe, give it a like, and share where you're watching from. The final unemployment benefit check had arrived 4 weeks earlier with the bureaucratic finality of a medical diagnosis that eliminated hope for financial recovery, marking the end of 14 months of systematic economic deterioration that had transformed Elena Rodriguez from a respected factory supervisor earning $71,000 annually at Cleveland's Meridian Steelworks to a desperate single mother whose daily survival calculations involved choosing between heating bills, groceries, and the mounting penalties that accompanied every unpaid municipal service, while her 8-year-old daughter Isabella watched their previously stable working-class existence dissolve into crisis management, requiring mathematical precision about every expenditure and resource allocation decision that determined whether they could maintain basic habitability in the narrow brick house that 4 generations of Rodriguez women had preserved through immigrant determination and industrial employment in Cleveland's volatile manufacturing economy. At 35 years old and 8 months removed from her husband Miguel's death in an industrial accident that had eliminated not only their emotional partnership, but also the dual-income household economics and shared domestic responsibilities essential for maintaining their modest but secure family life in the Tremont neighborhood, where her great-grandmother Carmen Rodriguez Morales, a Mexican immigrant who had arrived in Cleveland in 1915 with metalworking skills developed in Monterey's railroad repair facilities, and the determination to establish educational and economic opportunities for descendants who would benefit from American industrial expansion and democratic institutions that promised social mobility through union membership and community organization, rather than the hacienda system and political corruption that had limited opportunities in Mexico during the revolutionary period and economic instability that drove millions of immigrants to seek security and prosperity in American cities experiencing unprecedented manufacturing growth and labor organization movements that created middle-class opportunities for working families willing to organize collectively for economic justice and workplace safety improvements.
4 generations of Rodriguez women had expanded the property's value and maintained home ownership through careful financial management and adaptation to Cleveland's changing industrial conditions, preserving family wealth wealth during the Great Depression, when steel production cuts had eliminated over 40% of manufacturing jobs in Cuyahoga County, the 1970s deindustrialization crisis, when foreign competition and corporate relocations had devastated Cleveland's economic foundation, and the 2008 financial collapse, when predatory lending and municipal fiscal crisis had destroyed property values throughout neighborhoods where working-class families had invested their life savings in home ownership that represented both shelter and accumulated wealth that could support retirement security and intergenerational economic advancement through property equity and community stability that required long-term neighborhood investment and civic participation. The Rodriguez family had survived economic pressures that had eliminated thousands of immigrant families from Cleveland's home ownership roles during nearly a century of boom and bust cycles that characterized American industrial development, including the wartime production expansion of the 1940s, when defense contracts had created unprecedented employment opportunities for women and minority workers, the suburban migration of the 1950s and 1960s that had drained urban tax bases and eliminated commercial investment in previously stable working-class neighborhoods, the racial tensions and economic divestment of the 1970s and 1980s that had created widespread property abandonment and municipal service reductions in communities where residents lacked political influence to demand continued public investment and infrastructure maintenance that suburban constituencies received automatically through their superior electoral representation and economic resources. Carmen Rodriguez Morales had worked 16-hour days during the 1920s economic expansion, combining full-time employment at Republic Steel's packaging division with evening domestic service for wealthy families in Cleveland Heights, using her combined income to purchase their Tremont house outright within 12 years, while simultaneously supporting her husband's English language education and citizenship preparation that enabled his advancement from common laborer to shift supervisor at American Steel and Wire Company, creating the foundation for family economic mobility that their daughter Maria would expand through high school completion and secretarial training that provided stable employment during the Depression, when many families lost everything due to inadequate savings and over-reliance on single-income strategies that couldn't withstand extended unemployment or industrial contraction. Maria Rodriguez Santos had preserved the family home during World War II, while her husband served in the Pacific Theater, working double shifts at Fisher Body's Aircraft Component Division while managing household responsibilities and childcare for 3 children, using her wartime savings to install modern plumbing and electrical systems that increased property value while reducing maintenance costs, demonstrating the financial planning and technical knowledge that enabled working-class families to build wealth through strategic home improvements and long-term property investment rather than consumer spending that provided immediate gratification but eliminated opportunities for capital accumulation and intergenerational wealth transfer that required discipline and mathematical understanding of compound returns on educational and property investments. Elena's mother, Rosa Rodriguez Gutierrez, had expanded the family's economic foundation during the 1960s and 1970s by completing community college coursework in accounting while working full-time at Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company's billing department, using her improved credentials to secure supervisory positions that provided healthcare benefits and pension contributions that supported family economic security while enabling Rosa to save for Elena's college education through systematic investment in treasury bonds and savings accounts that earned modest but reliable returns during decades when working-class families could achieve middle-class stability through patient accumulation of assets and conservative financial management that prioritized security over speculation and risk-taking that wealthy families could afford due to their superior resources and professional investment management capabilities. Elena's transition from college graduate with a business degree to factory supervisor had occurred during the 1990s manufacturing boom, when companies like Meridian Steelworks were expanding production capacity and hiring management personnel with formal education and analytical skills that could implement quality control systems and efficiency improvements that helped American manufacturers compete with foreign producers through technological innovation and workforce development, rather than simple cost reduction strategies that had characterized earlier periods of industrial competition and corporate strategy development that emphasized short-term profit maximization over long-term operational sustainability and community economic development.
Her 12 years of employment at Meridian Steelworks had provided comprehensive training in industrial management, quality control systems, and employee relations that made her one of the facility's most effective supervisors, responsible for coordinating production schedules, managing inventory systems, and training new employees in safety procedures and manufacturing techniques that required both technical knowledge and interpersonal skills that had been developed through her college coursework in business administration, combined with practical experience in manufacturing environments that demanded precision, teamwork, and continuous learning about evolving technology and production methods that determine competitive success in global markets. But Miguel's death in a crane accident had introduced emotional trauma and practical challenges that exceeded her capacity to maintain the psychological focus and energy levels that effective industrial supervision required during circumstances that made every workday a struggle between professional responsibilities and grief management, while simultaneously dealing with insurance bureaucracy, funeral expenses, and the gradual realization that single parenthood would require financial and logistical adjustments that their previous household arrangements hadn't prepared her to manage independently without the emotional support and practical assistance that Miguel had provided through child care participation, household maintenance, and family decision-making processes that had distributed responsibilities and stress in ways that made both career advancement and family stability possible. The industrial accident had occurred during routine maintenance of overhead crane systems that transported finished steel products from manufacturing floors to shipping areas, when mechanical failure of cable assemblies had resulted in load shifting that had crushed Miguel along with 2 other employees, despite safety protocols and protective equipment that had been designed to prevent exactly such accidents, but that had proven inadequate during exceptional circumstances involving equipment age and maintenance scheduling that had been influenced by cost reduction pressures and corporate policies that prioritized production efficiency over comprehensive preventative maintenance that would have required temporary production shutdowns and equipment replacement expenses that quarterly profit requirements made difficult to justify to shareholders and corporate executives whose compensation depended on short-term financial performance rather than long-term operational safety and workforce protection. Isabella Rodriguez had adapted to their increasingly desperate circumstances with emotional maturity and practical intelligence that exceeded typical 8-year-old developmental patterns, making her an essential partner in household management, despite her age and the psychological trauma associated with losing her father, while simultaneously watching their family's economic foundation collapse through foreclosure threats, utility disconnections, and food insecurity that had transformed their previously stable working-class existence into daily survival calculations requiring adult-level understanding of financial priorities and resource conservation strategies that no elementary school student should need to comprehend or implement during crucial developmental periods that required security and stability for healthy psychological growth. Isabella's personality combined her father's mechanical aptitude and systematic approach to problem-solving with her mother's analytical capabilities and organizational skills, making her particularly effective at identifying household problems and developing creative solutions that adults might overlook due to their assumptions about conventional repair methods and standard operating procedures that didn't account for severe financial limitations, requiring improvised alternatives to professional services and commercial materials that their economic situation made impossible to afford through normal consumer channels and credit arrangements that required income verification and debt-to-income ratios that Elena's unemployment had made impossible to satisfy.
Her understanding of their financial situation was comprehensive and sophisticated beyond her chronological age. She monitored their declining bank balance through online banking access that Elena had provided to help with household budgeting and expense tracking, researched utility conservation techniques, using school computer lab internet access to minimize bills through energy-saving methods that could reduce their monthly expenses without sacrificing essential services, and maintained detailed lists of household maintenance issues that required attention but couldn't be addressed through professional repair services that exceeded their financial capacity for anything beyond absolute emergency interventions that threatened immediate safety or habitability standards that would trigger municipal housing code enforcement and potential condemnation proceedings. Isabella had also assumed responsibility for meal planning and grocery shopping assistance that involved mathematical calculations about nutritional value per dollar and comparison shopping techniques that maximized food purchasing power while maintaining adequate nutrition for growing children and working adults, demonstrating analytical skills and practical knowledge that reflected both intelligence and premature exposure to adult responsibilities that circumstances had made necessary for family survival, but that represented inappropriate developmental pressures that could affect long-term psychological health and educational achievement if their crisis situation continued beyond the short-term emergency period that Elena hoped would be resolved through renewed employment opportunities and economic recovery.
The 8-year-old had developed mechanical interests and observational skills that reflected her father's influence and her own natural curiosity about how household systems functioned, often identifying equipment problems and suggesting repair approaches that demonstrated understanding of basic engineering principles and troubleshooting methods that she had learned through observation of Miguel's home maintenance activities and independent research using library books and internet resources that provided technical information about plumbing, electrical systems, and structural maintenance that enabled her to contribute meaningfully to their family's crisis management efforts while maintaining academic performance and social relationships that required careful balance between premature adult responsibilities and normal childhood development needs. The burst pipe beneath their kitchen floor had occurred during the second week of February 2024, when Cleveland experienced 7 consecutive days of below-freezing temperatures that had strained aging infrastructure throughout neighborhoods where housing stock dated to the 1920s, and maintenance budgets had been inadequate for comprehensive winterization and preventative repairs that would have prevented freeze damage and water system failures that created emergency repair situations for families whose financial resources were insufficient for professional plumbing services that typically charged $200 to $400 for emergency calls, plus materials and labor costs that could easily exceed $1,000 for comprehensive pipe replacement and water damage remediation that insurance policies often excluded or limited through deductibles and coverage restrictions that made catastrophic repair costs personally responsible expenses. Elena's assessment of the plumbing emergency had revealed that water damage was spreading beneath flooring and potentially affecting structural supports and electrical systems that could create safety hazards and municipal code violations that would trigger housing inspections and potentially condemn their property if repairs weren't completed according to professional standards and timeframes that assumed adequate financial resources and access to licensed contractors whose services exceeded their available funds by thousands of dollars, while their foreclosure timeline made major repair investments economically irrational, even if financing were available through personal loans or credit arrangements that Elena's unemployment and deteriorating credit rating had made impossible to obtain. The repair situation had become a mathematical challenge involving cost-benefit analysis and risk assessment that required Elena to balance immediate safety concerns against long-term financial survival while considering whether temporary repair measures using improvised materials and techniques could prevent additional damage and maintain habitability until their economic situation improved through employment opportunities or assistance programs that could provide either income replacement or emergency home repair funding that might preserve their family's homeownership and prevent displacement to rental housing that their credit situation and employment status would make extremely difficult to secure through normal tenant qualification processes that required verifiable income and positive rental history. Elena's construction knowledge had been limited to basic maintenance skills that Miguel had taught her and general understanding of household systems that homeownership required, but her analytical capabilities and research skills had enabled her to identify plumbing repair techniques and material requirements that could address their emergency situation using borrowed tools and salvaged supplies that wouldn't require significant cash expenditure beyond their desperate financial capacity during circumstances that made every dollar a strategic resource allocation decision affecting their family's immediate survival and long-term housing security that represented the foundation for Isabella's educational stability and Elena's job search activities that required permanent address and telephone access for employment coordination and professional networking. Isabella's involvement in the plumbing repair project had begun with genuine desire to assist her mother during crisis circumstances that required family cooperation and creative problem-solving, but her participation had evolved into a systematic investigation of their house's construction details and mechanical systems that revealed inconsistencies and anomalies that adults might have dismissed as normal variations in 1920s building techniques, but that Isabella's analytical approach and attention to detail had identified as evidence of deliberate modifications and hidden features that exceeded typical residential construction and suggested purposes beyond normal household functionality and domestic convenience that characterized period architecture in working-class neighborhoods. The 8-year-old had noticed that basement ceiling heights varied in ways that didn't correspond to structural requirements or utility installation patterns, with certain areas showing evidence of excavation and reconstruction that used different materials and techniques than original construction, while maintaining external appearances that wouldn't attract attention from casual observation or routine maintenance activities that homeowners typically performed during normal ownership periods and property upkeep that characterized responsible homeownership and neighborhood stability maintenance that preserved community property values and residential character.
Isabella's mechanical curiosity had been stimulated by observations that floor construction near their basement stairs showed characteristics that differed from surrounding areas, with materials and installation techniques that indicated professional construction work performed during different time periods using methods that weren't consistent with normal maintenance activities or repair procedures that would be expected during the building's documented ownership history and residential use patterns that family records and neighborhood information had suggested represented typical working-class homeownership and domestic occupation that shouldn't have required specialized construction or concealment features that Isabella's investigation had begun to identify through systematic examination and documentation. The kitchen floor area where plumbing repairs were required had revealed construction details that challenged Isabella's understanding of normal residential building techniques, with support structures and material choices that indicated engineering sophistication and resource investment that exceeded what would be justified by standard household requirements, while suggesting construction purposes that required concealment and security considerations that weren't typical of normal domestic architecture during the 1920s building period, when their house had been constructed according to municipal records and family documentation that described typical working-class homeownership rather than specialized construction projects requiring professional expertise and unusual material resources. when Isabella had applied systematic investigation techniques that combined her analytical approach with practical curiosity about mechanical systems and construction details, her exploration had revealed that floorboards near the basement stairs were secured using different fastening methods and showed wear patterns that indicated regular access and movement despite being covered by kitchen appliances and furniture that suggested minimal disturbance during normal household activities and domestic use patterns that characterize their family's residential occupation and daily routine activities that hadn't included basement access or unusual floor manipulation that Isabella's investigation was revealing through careful observation and systematic testing of construction elements that appeared inconsistent with documented building history and residential functionality. Elena's discovery that her great-grandmother Carmen Rodriguez Morales had acquired their Tremont house through circumstances more complex than family stories had suggested began to emerge through documents found in the basement storage room while searching for water shutoff valves and plumbing access points that the emergency repair project had made necessary to investigate, despite Elena's previous reluctance to disturb family possessions and historical materials that represented emotional connections to deceased relatives whose memories she had been too overwhelmed by immediate survival concerns to process appropriately during the grief and financial crisis that had dominated their lives since Miguel's death and her subsequent unemployment had eliminated both emotional stability and economic security simultaneously. The basement storage area had been organized by Elena's mother Rosa before her death from cancer 3 years earlier, with carefully labeled boxes containing family documents, photographs, and personal belongings that documented 4 generations of Rodriguez women's experiences in Cleveland's industrial economy and immigrant community networks that had enabled their family's survival and advancement through mutual aid societies, union organizing, and collaborative child-rearing arrangements that had provided economic security and cultural preservation during periods when individual families lacked sufficient resources to maintain middle-class stability without community support systems that contemporary urban isolation and economic individualism had systematically undermined through suburban migration and cultural assimilation processes. Among Rose's carefully preserved documents, Elena discovered property acquisition papers that revealed Carmen Rodriguez Morales had purchased their house in 1927 not through conventional mortgage financing or savings accumulation, as family oral history had suggested, but through a complex arrangement involving cash payment of $3,200 that represented far more money than a Mexican immigrant factory worker could have accumulated during normal employment wages during the 1920s economic conditions that limited working-class earnings and savings opportunities, while discrimination and language barriers further restricted immigrant economic advancement through conventional career development and professional employment that required English fluency and social connections that recent immigrants typically lacked during their initial settlement periods. The property purchase documents included references to services rendered and confidential business arrangements that suggested Carmen had earned the house payment through activities that extended beyond normal factory employment, with correspondence indicating her involvement in community networks that provided services to Cleveland's business leaders and political figures during the Prohibition period when illegal alcohol distribution had created alternative economic opportunities for immigrants and working-class families whose cultural backgrounds and community connections enabled them to operate outside mainstream economic channels while providing services that wealthy customers required but couldn't obtain through legitimate commercial sources due to federal alcohol prohibition laws and social restrictions.
Further investigation of Carmen's papers revealed employment records that documented her official work at Republic Steel's packaging division during standard daytime shifts, but also showed evidence of evening and weekend activities that involved domestic service for prominent Cleveland families whose addresses in Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights represented the city's wealthiest residential areas where steel industry executives, railroad company officials, officials and banking family members maintained elaborate households that required extensive domestic staff and specialized services that enabled elite lifestyle maintenance during the prosperity of the 1920s economic expansion that had created unprecedented wealth concentration among industrial leaders and financial institutions. The domestic service employment had been arranged through what Carmen's records described as Mrs. Castellano's placement agency, which had specialized in providing reliable household staff for Cleveland's elite families while maintaining discretion about the personal activities and business arrangements that wealthy households conducted privately within their homes during the Prohibition era, when social entertaining and business networking often involved activities that required absolute confidentiality and trustworthy domestic staff who could observe privileged information without compromising client privacy or creating legal liability for employers whose social and business activities might conflict with federal prohibition enforcement and public morality standards. Carmen's correspondence with other domestic workers revealed that Mrs. Castellano's placement agency had been operated by the wife of Anthony the Ghost Castellano, the legendary bootlegger whose criminal organization had supplied illegal alcohol to Cleveland's elite social clubs, private parties, and business entertainment venues throughout the 1920s, while maintaining operational security through community networks that included immigrant families whose economic survival depended on discretion and loyalty to employers whose prosperity enabled generous compensation for reliable service and absolute silence about activities that could compromise both criminal operations and legitimate business reputations if disclosed to law enforcement or competing organizations. Elena discovered that Carmen had been specifically recruited for her literacy in both Spanish and English, her mechanical aptitude that enabled her to understand and maintain complex household equipment and security systems, and her family connections within Cleveland's Mexican immigrant community that provided information networks and mutual protection arrangements that helped Castellano's organization monitor law enforcement activities and maintain operational security while avoiding detection by federal prohibition agents and competing criminal organizations whose territorial disputes and law enforcement cooperation threatened independent bootlegging operations that served elite clientele requiring sophisticated distribution networks and absolute reliability. The documents revealed that Anthony Castellano's bootlegging operation had been fundamentally different from typical organized crime activities that characterize most Prohibition-era illegal alcohol distribution, operating instead as a sophisticated service provider for Cleveland's business and political elite, whose social entertaining and private consumption required high-quality imported alcohol that couldn't be obtained through normal speakeasy channels that served working-class customers with locally produced spirits that lacked the quality and social prestige that wealthy clients demanded for their private parties and business entertainment that required maintaining appearances of respectability and cultural sophistication. The operation had required sophisticated logistics coordination, financial management, and security arrangements that exceeded typical criminal organization capabilities, utilizing legitimate business infrastructure, including shipping companies, warehouse facilities, and financial institutions that provided cover for criminal activities while generating substantial profits that were invested in legitimate enterprises and political influence that protected the organization from law enforcement interference and competitive threats that typically destroyed smaller criminal organizations lacking institutional protection and community support networks. Carmen's role within this organization had extended beyond simple domestic service to include communication coordination,
financial record-keeping, and security monitoring that required intelligence capabilities and trustworthiness that Castellano's leadership had recognized and compensated through payments that exceeded normal domestic service wages by substantial margins, while providing additional benefits including housing assistance, educational opportunities for family members, and community protection services that ensured immigrant families' economic security and physical safety during periods when ethnic discrimination and economic competition created dangerous situations for Mexican families lacking institutional protection and community advocacy.
Elena's basement investigations had revealed construction anomalies that Carmen's documents helped explain through references to facility improvements and security installations that had been completed during 1926 and 1927 using specialized contractors and imported materials that exceeded normal residential construction capabilities while maintaining external appearances that prevented casual observation or neighborhood curiosity about unusual construction activities that might attract law enforcement attention or community speculation about the purposes served by construction modifications that differed significantly from typical home improvement projects. The basement ceiling showed evidence of professional excavation and structural reinforcement that had been completed using engineering techniques and construction materials that exceeded normal residential building standards while incorporating concealment features that prevented casual discovery of modified spaces and hidden access points that connected their house to underground systems extending beyond their property boundaries through tunnels that had been engineered for permanent use rather than temporary concealment or emergency escape purposes that characterized typical bootlegging hideouts and storage facilities. Isabella's investigation of basement wall construction had revealed stonework that differed significantly from the limestone foundation blocks used throughout their house's original construction, with fitted stones that showed professional masonry techniques and materials that had been imported from quarries that produced building stone with specific characteristics, including resistance to moisture infiltration, structural stability under pressure, and sound-dampening properties that suggested construction purposes requiring absolute concealment and security that exceeded normal residential basement utilities and storage requirements. The stonework showed tool marks and finishing techniques that indicated specialized craftsmanship and professional construction knowledge that wouldn't typically be available to normal residential contractors during the 1920s building period, suggesting involvement of workers with experience in mining engineering, tunnel construction, or specialized building projects that required underground excavation and structural engineering capabilities that exceeded typical residential construction industry expertise and resource availability that characterized normal home building and improvement activities during the period when their house had been modified for purposes beyond normal domestic functionality. Elena's conversations with elderly neighbors whose families had lived in Tremont since the 1920s had revealed community memories and oral history traditions that differed significantly from official historical records and newspaper accounts about neighborhood activities during the Prohibition era, with family stories describing unusual nighttime activities, unexplained prosperity among certain immigrant families, and community solidarity that had protected residents from law enforcement harassment and outside interference during periods when federal prohibition enforcement had created tension between government authority and community autonomy in neighborhoods where residents maintained cultural traditions and economic arrangements that conflicted with mainstream American social norms and legal requirements. Mrs. Esperanza Gutierrez, whose family had lived 3 blocks from the Rodriguez house since 1924, remembered childhood observations of late-night deliveries and sophisticated security arrangements that had characterized certain neighborhood properties during the late 1920s,
with organized watch systems and communication networks that had enabled rapid response to law enforcement presence while maintaining normal residential appearances during daytime hours when neighborhood activities appeared typical of working-class immigrant communities whose residents worked in Cleveland's steel mills and manufacturing facilities while maintaining cultural traditions and mutual aid societies. The neighborhood oral history included detailed descriptions of community cooperation and shared prosperity that had enabled multiple immigrant families to achieve homeownership and economic advancement during the late 1920s despite employment limitations and discrimination that typically restricted immigrant economic mobility, with collaborative arrangements that had provided childcare, elder care, and economic support that helped families navigate financial crises and maintain property ownership during economic downturns that eliminated homeownership opportunities for families lacking community support networks and alternative income sources beyond normal industrial employment wages.
Isabella's systematic investigation of their basement construction had revealed architectural features that exceeded her initial curiosity about plumbing repair requirements, with detailed observations that documented construction techniques and material choices that suggested professional engineering planning and resource investment that indicated purposes requiring permanent installation and ongoing operational capability rather than temporary concealment or simple storage that would have characterized typical bootlegging facilities and illegal alcohol hiding places that law enforcement raids had discovered throughout Cleveland during Prohibition enforcement activities. The 8-year-old had developed investigation techniques that combined her natural mechanical curiosity with methodical documentation and analysis that enabled her to identify construction details that adults might dismiss as normal variations in 1920s building techniques, but that her systematic approach had revealed as evidence of deliberate design features and specialized construction purposes that required explanation through historical research and family document analysis that Elena's basement storage exploration was providing through Carmen's preserved papers and correspondence. Isabella's measurements and observations had documented basement ceiling height variations that created hidden spaces and concealed areas that couldn't be observed through casual basement inspection, but that systematic investigation revealed as access points and concealment features that connected to tunnel systems extending beyond their property boundaries through underground construction that required professional excavation and engineering capabilities that exceeded normal residential construction industry resources and expertise during the 1920s building period, when such specialized work would have required involvement of workers with mining, tunneling, or specialized construction experience. The child's investigation had also revealed mechanical systems and infrastructure elements that indicated their basement had been designed to support activities requiring electrical power, ventilation, and communication capabilities that exceeded normal residential requirements while maintaining concealment from external observation and law enforcement detection that characterized sophisticated criminal organization infrastructure rather than simple illegal alcohol storage and distribution that typical bootlegging operations had utilized during Prohibition enforcement periods when most criminal activities had been limited by resource constraints and technical capabilities. Elena's research into neighborhood history during the 1920s had revealed community organization and mutual protection networks that had enabled immigrant families to maintain economic security and physical safety during periods when ethnic discrimination, economic competition, and prohibition enforcement had created dangerous conditions for families whose cultural backgrounds and alternative economic activities made them vulnerable to law enforcement harassment, vigilante violence, and economic exploitation by employers and landlords who could threaten immigrant families' residence and employment security without legal accountability or community protection. The Tremont neighborhood had developed sophisticated communication systems and coordinated response capabilities that had enabled rapid warning and mutual protection when law enforcement raids or outside threats had endangered community members involved in alternative economic activities that provided prosperity and security that normal industrial employment couldn't guarantee during economic downturns, and discrimination that limited immigrant advancement opportunities through legitimate career development and professional employment that required English fluency and social connections typically unavailable to recent immigrants and their families. Community oral history described organized watch systems, coded communication methods, and shared security arrangements that had protected multiple families simultaneously while maintaining normal residential appearances and community activities that prevented law enforcement suspicion and outside interference with neighborhood economic arrangements and cultural practices that differed from mainstream American social norms, but that provided community stability and mutual support that enabled immigrant families to achieve economic advancement and social security through cooperative strategies rather than individual competition. Elena learned that her family's homeownership and economic stability had been preserved through community networks that had continued to provide mutual aid and protection long after Prohibition ended, and the specific economic opportunities that had enabled 1920s prosperity had disappeared, with ongoing cooperation in childcare, elder care, property maintenance, and crisis assistance that had helped Rodriguez women maintain home ownership and economic stability through subsequent decades of economic challenge and social change that had eliminated many of the community institutions and cultural practices that had originally enabled immigrant families' advancement and security.
The documents revealed that Carmen Rodriguez Morales had served as more than domestic staff within Castellano's organization, functioning as communication coordinator and intelligence analyst whose literacy, cultural connections, and analytical capabilities had made her essential for coordinating complex logistical operations that required real-time information about law enforcement activities, competitive threats, and customer requirements that determined successful completion of alcohol importation and distribution activities that served Cleveland's elite social and business communities during the Prohibition period, when such services required absolute reliability and security. Carmen's correspondence indicated her responsibility for maintaining coded communication systems that connected Castellano's Cleveland operations to international smuggling networks in Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean that provided imported alcohol products with authentic origins and quality certifications that elite customers required for their social entertaining and private consumption that reflected their cultural sophistication and economic status rather than simple desire to violate prohibition laws for recreational or rebellious purposes that characterized public perception of illegal alcohol consumption. Her role had included financial record-keeping and transaction coordination that tracked complex payment arrangements and credit systems that enabled elite customers to maintain accounts and arrange bulk purchases that provided consistent supply for their social obligations and business entertainment requirements while maintaining discretion about their prohibition law violations that could have compromised their professional reputations and political influence if disclosed through law enforcement investigations or competitive business intelligence that opponents could use for economic or political advantage. The documents showed that Carmen had also coordinated security arrangements and counterintelligence activities that monitored law enforcement plans and investigated potential threats from competing criminal organizations whose territorial ambitions and operational conflicts threatened Castellano's exclusive service relationships with Cleveland's elite clientele, who required absolute reliability and security that smaller criminal operations couldn't provide due to their limited resources and institutional connections that protected sophisticated criminal enterprises from law enforcement interference and competitive disruption.
Elena's basement investigation had revealed that the underground tunnel system connected to their house represented engineering achievement that exceeded typical bootlegging infrastructure through sophisticated construction techniques that indicated professional mining and tunneling expertise, combined with architectural planning that created permanent facilities capable of supporting complex operations requiring security, concealment, and operational efficiency that characterized legitimate business infrastructure rather than temporary criminal hideouts that law enforcement raids typically discovered during Prohibition enforcement activities. The tunnel construction showed evidence of professional surveying and engineering planning that had considered drainage requirements, structural integrity, ventilation needs, and concealment objectives, while incorporating access control and security features that enabled selective entry and emergency evacuation capabilities that protected operational personnel and valuable materials from law enforcement raids and competitive threats that could have eliminated criminal organization assets and personnel through arrest, confiscation, or violent confrontation with rival works competing for territorial control and customer relationships. Isabella's investigation had documented construction details that indicated the tunnel system extended beyond their immediate neighborhood, through underground connections that linked multiple properties and provided access to transportation networks, including railroad facilities, shipping terminals, and warehouse districts that enabled efficient movement of imported alcohol products from international smuggling entry points to distribution centers serving elite customers throughout Cleveland and surrounding communities, whose social and business activities required reliable access to high-quality imported alcohol products that exceeded typical bootlegging operation capabilities and resource availability during Prohibition enforcement periods when most criminal activities were limited by financial and technical constraints.
The morning of February 18, 2024, had begun with Elena's discovery that water damage from their burst pipe had spread beyond the immediate kitchen area to affect basement ceiling tiles and potentially electrical systems that posed immediate safety hazards requiring emergency intervention, despite their complete lack of financial resources for professional plumbing repair, electrical inspection, or water damage remediation that could easily cost thousands of dollars, while their foreclosure timeline made major repair investments economically impossible, even if credit or emergency assistance were available through governmental programs or community organizations whose bureaucratic requirements and processing delays exceeded their urgent timeline for preventing additional property damage and safety violations. Isabella's systematic investigation of water flow patterns and structural damage had revealed that moisture infiltration was following paths through floor construction that didn't correspond to normal building layouts or logical pipe routing that characterized typical residential plumbing systems, with water movement patterns suggesting hidden spaces and concealed pathways that enabled liquid penetration through areas where normal construction shouldn't have provided access routes for water damage spreading beyond immediate pipe failure locations to affect basement areas that appeared structurally separate from kitchen plumbing systems. Elena's assessment of the water damage had forced her to remove kitchen appliances and furniture that had concealed floor areas where Isabella's previous investigation had identified construction anomalies and unusual fastening methods, revealing floorboard sections that showed wear patterns and access evidence that contradicted their family's residential use patterns, while suggesting regular entry and movement through floor areas that normal household activities wouldn't have disturbed during decades of typical domestic occupation and maintenance that characterized their family's homeownership experience. The removal of their refrigerator and kitchen table had exposed floorboard areas where Isabella's measurements and observations had documented construction techniques that differed from surrounding floor installation, with materials and fastening methods that indicated professional construction work performed during different time periods using specialized techniques that exceeded normal residential flooring capabilities, while incorporating concealment features that prevented casual discovery of modified spaces and hidden access points that Isabella's persistent investigation was systematically revealing through careful analysis and documentation of construction details.
When Elena applied crowbar leverage to floorboards that Isabella had identified as constructed differently from surrounding areas, the resistance patterns and structural response indicated that these boards weren't simply secured to standard floor joists, but were connected to mechanical systems and access mechanisms that required specific manipulation techniques to activate properly without damaging concealment features that had been engineered to prevent accidental discovery while enabling authorized access through procedures that required knowledge of proper operation methods and mechanical understanding that typical residential maintenance wouldn't have provided. Isabella's observation that certain floorboards responded differently to pressure and movement had led her to experiment with various manipulation techniques that combined her analytical approach with practical curiosity about mechanical systems, eventually discovering that simultaneous pressure applied to specific points while rotating certain boards in precise sequences activated hidden mechanisms that had been concealed within floor construction through engineering sophistication that exceeded typical residential building capabilities while maintaining normal appearance during casual observation and routine household activities that characterized their family's homeownership experience. The activation sequence required coordinated manipulation of 3 separate floorboard sections in specific timing patterns that indicated professional design and installation by people with mechanical engineering knowledge and construction expertise that wouldn't normally be available for residential projects during the 1920s building period, suggesting involvement of specialized workers with experience in security systems, mechanical devices, or industrial equipment that required precision operation and concealment from unauthorized access while enabling reliable function for people who understood proper activation procedures and mechanical understanding that typical residential maintenance wouldn't have provided. When Isabella successfully completed the activation sequence through persistent experimentation and systematic testing of different manipulation combinations, the floor section responded by revealing mechanical hinges and counterweight systems that enabled a concealed access panel to open smoothly and quietly despite decades of concealment and minimal maintenance, demonstrating engineering quality and construction durability that indicated professional installation using premium materials and sophisticated mechanical design that preserved functionality throughout extended periods without regular servicing or adjustment. The concealed access panel revealed stone steps descending approximately 12 feet below their basement floor level, constructed using fitted limestone blocks that matched their house's foundation materials but showed craftsmanship and finishing techniques that exceeded normal foundation construction while incorporating drainage systems and ventilation features that enabled permanent human occupation and equipment operation in underground spaces that had been engineered for ongoing use rather than temporary storage or emergency concealment that characterized typical Prohibition-era hiding places.
Elena's flashlight beam revealed that the stone construction extended beyond their immediate access point through carefully engineered tunnel systems that connected to larger underground chambers whose scale and architectural sophistication challenged every assumption about residential construction capabilities and resource requirements during the 1920s building period, when such excavation and engineering work would have required professional expertise and significant financial investment that exceeded normal homeowner resources, while demanding absolute secrecy to prevent community awareness and law enforcement detection. The stone steps showed wear patterns that indicated regular use over extended periods, with smooth surfaces and rounded edges that resulted from decades of foot traffic by people who accessed the underground facilities frequently enough to create permanent alterations in stone surfaces that required substantial time and repeated contact to develop, suggesting operational use rather than occasional emergency access or simple storage retrieval that might have characterized temporary concealment facilities used during Prohibition enforcement periods when most bootlegging operations relied on temporary hiding places rather than permanent infrastructure investment. Isabella's excitement about discovering secret passages had been tempered by Elena's military-trained caution about entering unknown underground spaces that could contain structural hazards, environmental dangers, or security risks that exceeded their ability to assess safely without proper equipment and emergency communication capabilities. But Isabella's argument that their desperate financial situation required investigation of any discovery that might provide solutions to their survival crisis carried logic psychological weight that Elena couldn't dismiss when conventional options had been exhausted, and foreclosure proceedings would eliminate their family heritage within weeks. The tunnel construction visible from their access point showed engineering capabilities that exceeded typical frontier construction techniques available during the 1920s building period, suggesting professional mining engineering, tunnel construction expertise, or specialized building knowledge that indicated involvement of workers with formal training and experience in underground construction projects that required sophisticated planning, structural engineering, and environmental control systems that enabled permanent occupation and operational use, rather than simple concealment or temporary storage that would have satisfied most bootlegging operation requirements during Prohibition enforcement periods when criminal organizations typically relied on mobile operations and temporary facilities rather than permanent infrastructure investment. Elena's assessment of the air quality within the tunnel system revealed atmospheric conditions that remained surprisingly fresh despite the underground location and apparent decades since last maintenance, indicating ventilation systems that continued to function effectively through natural or mechanical circulation that maintained breathable air quality and prevented accumulation of toxic gases or moisture that typically made underground spaces uninhabitable without ongoing environmental control and maintenance that required technical knowledge and regular access for inspection and repair activities. The tunnel dimensions were sufficient for comfortable adult movement while maintaining structural integrity that had preserved the underground space throughout decades of Cleveland's freeze-thaw cycles and soil movement that typically damaged underground construction in the region, demonstrating engineering quality and construction techniques that indicated professional planning and execution using materials and methods that exceeded normal residential construction capabilities while incorporating features that enabled ongoing operational use and maintenance access. 20 feet beyond their access point, the tunnel opened into a chamber that eliminated any possibility of rational explanation based on normal residential construction or typical Prohibition-era bootlegging facilities. With architectural scale and construction quality that indicated professional engineering planning and resource investment that exceeded anything justified by simple alcohol storage or temporary concealment requirements that characterized most criminal organization infrastructure during the 1920s Prohibition enforcement period, when law enforcement raids and competitive threats made elaborate permanent facilities economically impractical and operationally dangerous. The chamber measured approximately 30 feet in diameter and 12 feet in height, excavated from solid limestone bedrock using professional mining techniques and finished with fitted stone blocks that displayed craftsmanship comparable to institutional construction or architectural projects that required permanent durability and sophisticated engineering, rather than temporary utility or simple concealment that would have satisfied most bootlegging operation requirements during Prohibition enforcement periods, when criminal organizations typically relied on mobile operations and temporary facilities rather than permanent infrastructure investment.
Isabella stood in the center of this impossible space, documenting architectural features and construction details with her phone camera, while providing excited commentary about stonework, ceiling construction, and engineering capabilities that exceeded her previous understanding of 1920s building techniques and residential construction possibilities, her 8-year-old analytical mind processing architectural achievement that challenged fundamental assumptions about historical timelines, technological capabilities, and resource availability during the period when the underground facility must have been constructed through coordination of professional expertise and substantial financial investment. The chamber's most remarkable feature was its ceiling, which displayed electrical installation points and mounting systems for equipment that indicated the underground space had been designed to support sophisticated technological capabilities and communication systems that required ongoing electrical power and maintenance access, suggesting operational purposes that extended beyond simple storage or temporary concealment to encompass activities requiring permanent infrastructure and ongoing technical support that characterized legitimate business operations rather than typical criminal organization facilities. Elena's systematic exploration of the wall walls had revealed concealed panels and hidden compartments that were integrated into the stonework through mechanical systems and activation devices that required specific knowledge and manipulation techniques to access safely without damaging concealment mechanisms or triggering security systems
that might have been designed to protect valuable contents from unauthorized access while enabling legitimate users to retrieve materials and equipment that required secure storage and controlled access during operational periods. The concealed storage systems showed engineering sophistication that indicated professional security design and installation by people with specialized knowledge of mechanical devices, locking mechanisms, and concealment techniques that exceeded typical residential security capabilities while incorporating features that enabled rapid access and emergency evacuation if law enforcement raids or competitive threats required immediate material removal and facility abandonment that characterized operational security requirements for criminal organizations during Prohibition enforcement periods. Isabella's investigation of wall construction details had revealed activation mechanisms that combined mechanical precision with concealment effectiveness, requiring simultaneous manipulation of stone elements that appeared to be permanent architectural features, but that actually functioned as access controls for hidden storage areas containing materials and equipment that had been preserved in environmental conditions that prevented deterioration and maintained operational readiness despite decades of storage without regular maintenance or inspection that typical equipment would have required. The first concealed chamber that Elena successfully accessed contained wooden crates marked with shipping labels and customs documentation that indicated international importation of premium alcohol products, including Scottish whiskey, French champagne, and Caribbean rum that represented the high-quality imported beverages that Castellano's organization had provided to Cleveland's elite customers, whose social entertaining and private consumption required authentic products with verifiable origins and quality certifications that domestic bootlegging operations couldn't provide due to their limited resources and production capabilities. But the wooden crates also contained materials that transcended simple alcohol storage to include documentation, equipment, and supplies that indicated the underground facility had served operational purposes requiring ongoing activity and sophisticated support capabilities, rather than simple warehouse storage that would have characterized typical bootlegging infrastructure during Prohibition enforcement periods when most criminal organizations relied on temporary facilities and mobile operations, rather than permanent installation and complex operational support systems. A second concealed chamber contained metal filing cabinets with documentation that revealed the true scope and sophistication of Castellano's criminal organization, including financial records that documented systematic coordination with legitimate business institutions and governmental agencies whose cooperation had enabled large-scale criminal operations that transcended typical bootlegging activities to encompass comprehensive economic manipulation and institutional corruption that affected Cleveland's business community and political structure during the Prohibition period, when federal enforcement created opportunities for criminal organizations to develop influential relationships with corrupted officials and business leaders. The financial documentation included bank account records, investment portfolios, and business partnership agreements that proved Castellano's organization had operated with resources and institutional connections that exceeded typical criminal organization capabilities, maintaining legitimate business relationships with major Cleveland banks, industrial corporations, and governmental agencies whose cooperation enabled systematic money laundering, tax avoidance, and regulatory manipulation that protected criminal operations from law enforcement interference while generating profits that were invested in legitimate enterprises and political influence.
Elena discovered correspondence between Castellano's organization and prominent Cleveland business leaders, including steel industry executives, railroad company officials, and banking family members, whose names appeared in official city histories as respected community leaders and civic contributors rather than criminal conspirators who had coordinated with bootlegging operations to manipulate governmental policies and business regulations in ways that benefited both criminal activities and legitimate business interests through shared objectives of profit maximization and regulatory avoidance. The documentation revealed that Castellano's bootlegging operation had been fundamentally integrated with Cleveland's legitimate business community through financial partnerships, political coordination, and mutual protection arrangements that enabled criminal activities to operate with institutional support and legal immunity, while providing legitimate businesses with competitive advantages and regulatory protection that exceeded anything available through normal business operations and governmental compliance that characterized typical corporate activities during the 1920s economic expansion period. Isabella's systematic examination of the filing cabinets had revealed organizational systems and record-keeping procedures that indicated professional business management and accounting capabilities that exceeded typical criminal organization administrative functions, with detailed financial tracking, tax preparation documents, and legal compliance materials that suggested Castellano's operation had maintained legitimate business facades and governmental relationships that enabled criminal activities to operate through established institutional channels rather than outside legal frameworks. The most shocking discovery was documentation that proved systematic involvement of federal governmental agencies and officials in Castellano's criminal operations, including correspondence with federal prohibition enforcement agents, Treasury Department officials, and Customs Service administrators who had been providing operational intelligence, legal protection, and regulatory assistance that enabled bootlegging activities to operate with governmental coordination rather than law enforcement opposition that public policy and official enforcement claims had suggested characterized federal prohibition enforcement throughout the 1920s period. Federal agency correspondence revealed systematic coordination between criminal organizations and governmental officials who had been using prohibition enforcement as cover for their own criminal activities, including theft of confiscated alcohol, extortion of legitimate businesses, and embezzlement of federal enforcement funding that was supposed to support alcohol prohibition but was actually being diverted to personal enrichment and criminal operation protection through coordinated corruption that involved multiple federal agencies and local law enforcement organizations. The documentation included detailed financial arrangements between Castellano's organization and federal officials who had been receiving regular payments for intelligence about enforcement activities, protection from prosecution, and assistance with importation logistics that enabled criminal operations to avoid law enforcement interference, while maintaining operational security and competitive advantages that eliminated smaller criminal organizations lacking governmental protection and institutional coordination that characterized sophisticated criminal enterprises during the Prohibition period. Elena's analysis of the federal correspondence revealed that prohibition enforcement had been systematically compromised by corruption that extended throughout multiple levels of governmental administration, with criminal coordination involving federal agents, local law enforcement, judicial officials, and political leaders whose public support for prohibition enforcement had concealed their private participation in criminal activities that generated substantial personal profits while eliminating competitive threats through selective enforcement that protected favored criminal organizations while destroying independent operators. The federal documentation also revealed that stolen alcohol confiscated during legitimate raids had been systematically diverted to criminal organizations rather than destroyed according to official policy, creating governmental supply chains that provided premium imported alcohol to bootlegging operations at reduced costs, while enabling federal officials to profit from both enforcement activities and criminal coordination that characterized institutional corruption affecting prohibition enforcement throughout the Cleveland region and potentially other major metropolitan areas. Beyond the chamber containing financial records and federal correspondence, Isabella's continued exploration had revealed access to a larger underground vault whose construction quality and security features exceeded anything they had previously discovered, with architectural sophistication and engineering capabilities that indicated this space had been designed as the operational center and primary storage facility for Castellano's criminal organization rather than simple auxiliary storage or temporary concealment that characterized most of the underground facility's other areas and chambers.
The vault construction incorporated professional security features, including mechanical locking systems, environmental controls, and structural reinforcement that enabled protection of valuable materials and equipment from both environmental damage and unauthorized access, while maintaining operational functionality that supported ongoing business activities rather than simple storage that would have characterized typical criminal organization resource management during Prohibition enforcement periods, when most bootlegging operations relied on temporary facilities and mobile operational strategies. Elena's initial assessment of the vault contents revealed wooden pallets stacked with metal containers that showed professional packaging and storage techniques designed to preserve contents through extended periods without environmental deterioration or security compromise, with shipping labels and inventory documentation that indicated systematic organization and professional management of valuable materials that required careful handling and controlled access during operational periods and long-term storage. The metal containers contained gold bars stamped with Federal Reserve markings and authentication numbers that indicated these weren't privately owned precious metals or typical criminal organization assets, but stolen federal government gold reserves that had been diverted from official transportation and storage systems through criminal operations that involved coordination with federal officials and transportation companies whose cooperation enabled systematic theft of governmental resources on scales that exceeded typical criminal organization capabilities and resource requirements during the Prohibition period, when most criminal enterprises lacked institutional connections and governmental protection necessary for large-scale resource theft and federal crime coordination. Isabella's excitement about discovering real treasure had been matched by Elena's growing realization that their accidental discovery represented evidence of federal crimes that extended far beyond simple prohibition violations to encompass systematic theft of governmental resources, institutional corruption, and criminal conspiracy that involved federal agencies, local law enforcement, and legitimate business institutions whose coordination had enabled criminal operations to achieve unprecedented scale and sophistication while maintaining operational security and legal protection through corrupted official channels. The gold bars were accompanied by documentation that revealed the systematic nature of federal gold theft and the institutional coordination required to accomplish such large-scale criminal operations, including transportation schedules, security procedures, and personnel assignments that enabled criminal operatives to intercept federal gold shipments while avoiding detection through coordination with corrupted federal officials and transportation company employees, whose participation enabled criminal operations to access governmental resources and security information that legitimate criminal organizations typically couldn't obtain through normal intelligence gathering and operational planning methods. The comprehensive documentation discovered within Castellano's underground vault revealed that Anthony the Ghost Castellano's criminal organization had been operating as the covert operational arm of a systematic federal gold theft conspiracy that involved high-ranking officials within the Treasury Department, Federal Reserve System, and United States Mint, whose coordinated criminal activities had diverted millions of dollars in federal gold reserves from official transportation and storage systems to private enrichment and criminal organization funding that exceeded the scope of typical organized crime during the Prohibition period, when most criminal enterprises lacked institutional connections and governmental protection necessary for large-scale resource theft and federal crime coordination. The Treasury Department correspondence dated between 1925 and 1929 documented detailed coordination between federal officials and Castellano's organization regarding scheduled gold shipments from Federal Reserve banks in New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago to regional distribution centers throughout the Midwest, with transportation routes, security procedures, and personnel assignments that enabled criminal operatives to intercept federal gold shipments while maintaining official documentation that concealed theft through fraudulent shipping records and inventory manipulation that prevented detection through normal governmental accounting and auditing procedures that were designed to track federal precious metal reserves and prevent unauthorized diversion. The banking documentation included detailed records of systematic financial fraud involving manipulation of federal banking regulations, falsification of loan documentation, and coordination with federal banking officials, whose cooperation enabled criminal organizations to access legitimate financial services while avoiding regulatory oversight and law enforcement investigation that normal criminal activities would have attracted through suspicious transaction reporting and governmental compliance requirements that characterized federal banking supervision during the Prohibition enforcement period. Elena's analysis of banking correspondence revealed that financial institution participation in Castellano's criminal network had been motivated by both corruption payments and shared economic objectives, with bank executives receiving substantial personal benefits while their institutions gained competitive advantages through access to capital resources and investment opportunities that weren't available through normal banking operations and regulatory compliance that limited legitimate financial institutions' ability to achieve maximum profitability during economic expansion periods that created unprecedented opportunities for financial growth and institutional advancement.
The political correspondence reveals systematic coordination between criminal organizations and elected officials, including Cleveland mayors, Ohio state legislators, and federal congressional representatives whose policy decisions and administrative actions had been systematically influenced through corruption payments and political coordination that enabled criminal objectives to be achieved through legitimate governmental processes and legal administrative frameworks, rather than through opposition to governmental authority that characterized typical criminal organization strategies and law enforcement relationships. Mayor Harold Burton's administration had been systematically infiltrated by Castellano's organization through corruption of municipal officials, police department coordination, and administrative policy manipulation that enabled criminal activities to operate with official municipal protection while maintaining public appearances of law enforcement cooperation and civic responsibility that concealed the systematic coordination between criminal organizations and legitimate governmental institutions whose leadership had been compromised through financial corruption and political coordination. The state governmental infiltration had involved systematic corruption of Ohio state officials, including legislative representatives, administrative department officials, and law enforcement agencies whose policy decisions and enforcement priorities had been influenced through political coordination and financial arrangements that enabled criminal operations to achieve statewide protection and institutional cooperation that exceeded local political influence, while providing criminal organizations with access to state governmental resources and legal authority that normal criminal enterprises couldn't obtain through conventional political influence and corruption strategies. Eliana's analysis of federal political correspondence revealed that congressional representatives and federal administrative officials had been systematically coordinating with Castellano's criminal organization through political influence operations that included campaign contributions, lobbying activities, and direct corruption arrangements that enabled criminal objectives to influence federal policy decisions regarding prohibition enforcement, financial regulation, and law enforcement priorities that affected criminal organization operations and competitive advantages throughout the regional and national scope of criminal activities. The documentation revealed systematic corruption of law enforcement agencies at local, state, and federal levels, whose coordinated cooperation had provided Castellano's criminal organization with operational intelligence, legal protection, and enforcement immunity that enabled criminal activities to operate with law enforcement authorization rather than opposition, while maintaining public appearances of criminal investigation and prohibition enforcement that concealed the systematic coordination between criminal organizations and legitimate law enforcement institutions whose integrity had been compromised through financial corruption and institutional infiltration. Cleveland Police Department corruption had been coordinated through systematic arrangement involving police officials, detective divisions, and patrol officers, whose cooperation enabled criminal operations to receive advance warning about law enforcement activities, while providing protection from arrest and prosecution that exceeded typical criminal organization defensive strategies during prohibition enforcement periods when federal and local agencies were supposedly coordinating comprehensive law enforcement responses to organized crime and illegal alcohol distribution throughout major metropolitan areas. The county law enforcement corruption had involved systematic coordination with Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Department officials, whose cooperation provided criminal operations with regional law enforcement protection and intelligence about federal enforcement activities, while enabling criminal organizations to coordinate with legitimate law enforcement agencies for mutual protection and operational support that benefited both criminal objectives and law enforcement officials through financial arrangements and political coordination that exceeded normal law enforcement integrity and professional standards. Federal law enforcement agency infiltration had been achieved through systematic corruption of Prohibition enforcement agents, Treasury Department investigators, and federal marshal services, whose cooperation enabled criminal operations to avoid federal prosecution while receiving advance intelligence about federal investigation activities and enforcement priorities that enabled criminal organizations to adapt their operations and maintain competitive advantages over independent criminal enterprises lacking governmental protection and institutional cooperation. Isabella's examination of law enforcement correspondence had revealed that criminal organization cooperation with corrupted law enforcement officials had involved not only protection from prosecution, but also active assistance with criminal operations, including transportation coordination, evidence suppression, and elimination of competitive criminal organizations through selective enforcement that protected favored criminal enterprises while eliminating independent operators through coordinated law enforcement action that appeared to represent legitimate prohibition enforcement but actually served criminal organization objectives and competitive strategy.
Beyond governmental and business institutional infiltration, Castellano's criminal organization had achieved systematic integration with community social institutions, including religious organizations, educational institutions, and civic organizations whose leadership and membership had been systematically influenced through financial contributions, community development programs, and social services that provided criminal organizations with community support and social legitimacy while maintaining operational security and public acceptance that enabled criminal activities to operate with community protection rather than opposition that typically characterized community relationships with criminal organizations during Prohibition enforcement periods when most criminal activities were viewed as threats to community stability and social values because the organization's criminal activities were often perceived as a threat to community values.
The documentation proved that modern banking institutions, political organizations, and corporate enterprises throughout the Cleveland region and broader Ohio economic system had been built on foundations of systematic criminal activity that included federal gold theft, governmental corruption, and institutional conspiracy that exceeded anything contemporary legal systems and public accountability mechanisms had been designed to address through normal judicial processes and democratic oversight that assumed institutional legitimacy and historical accuracy rather than systematic deception and criminal conspiracy spanning multiple generations of American political and economic development. Elena faced impossible choices between personal survival and public accountability when their family's desperate financial situation could be resolved immediately through private sale or negotiation involving the stolen federal gold, whose contemporary value exceeded $300 million, while simultaneously providing evidence that could restore justice and historical accuracy, but would inevitably expose them to retaliation from institutions whose resources and political influence exceeded anything individual families could resist through normal legal protection and governmental assistance that assumed rather than questioned institutional legitimacy and historical narratives that exceeded typical criminal organization capabilities through legal systems, media control, and political influence that could neutralize threats to institutional security through mechanisms that appeared legitimate while serving criminal protection objectives that transcended normal law enforcement capabilities and democratic accountability processes. But Elena's military experience had taught her that transparency and public exposure often provided better protection than secrecy and institutional cooperation when evidence of systematic criminal activity could benefit society while protecting families through visibility that made covert elimination impossible for institutions whose authority depended on maintaining public legitimacy and democratic appearances that could be compromised through exposure of criminal activities and historical deception that characterized institutional development and contemporary power structures.
The FBI's Financial Crimes Division and Treasury Department's Internal Investigation Unit had responded within hours to media reports about Elena's discovery, launching coordinated federal investigations that included forensic analysis of Castellano's documentation, authentication of stolen federal gold, and comprehensive review of contemporary institutional relationships that could indicate ongoing criminal activity or systematic concealment of historical crimes that affected federal resource management and governmental institutional integrity throughout multiple governmental agencies and political jurisdictions. Isabella's careful documentation and photographic evidence of their underground discoveries had provided federal investigators with comprehensive materials that enabled immediate verification of criminal evidence while protecting Elena's family through official governmental recognition of their cooperation and witness status that provided federal protection services and legal representation that exceeded anything private institutions could eliminate or circumvent through normal political influence and economic pressure that characterized typical institutional responses to threats against historical legitimacy and contemporary authority. Isabella would grow up as the child whose curiosity had changed American understanding of institutional development and federal corruption, while providing evidence that enabled comprehensive legal proceedings and historical corrections that restored dignity to communities whose heritage and resources had been systematically stolen through institutional criminal conspiracy that had shaped regional development and national political structures for nearly a century. The federal settlements and legal damages resulting from Elena's evidence had provided their family with financial resources that ensured Isabella's educational opportunities and long-term security, while enabling Elena to pursue advocacy work and historical scholarship that honored both their accidental discovery and the communities whose resources had been systematically stolen through institutional criminal activities that contemporary legal proceedings would address through restitution and accountability mechanisms. Their Tremont house would be preserved as a historical site, documenting American institutional corruption and community resistance, while providing Elena's family with permanent housing security and ongoing income through educational programs and historical preservation activities that contributed to public understanding of institutional accountability and democratic transparency requirements that could prevent future systematic criminal activity and governmental corruption. As federal agents, historical scholars, and community advocates continued their investigations and legal proceedings based on Elena's discovery, their family had achieved transformation from victims of economic crisis into agents of historical justice whose accidental discovery would provide long-term financial security while contributing to institutional accountability and democratic transparency that served American society's interests in governmental integrity and historical accuracy rather than institutional protection and criminal immunity that had characterized previous approaches to systematic corruption and federal crime investigation.